Merilyn Moos, who's spoken here before, and I'm pleased to say always gets a good attendance.
Thank you.
Anyway, and you can see what the title is. I don't need to go into because it's actually there, and there's a little bit underneath if you go on the website. But I don't think I need to say any more because I think Merilyn will be able to more than adequately explain herself what she wants to say. So, Merilyn, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm basically going to read this, but with I'm going to try and look up every now and then. While there is much interest in the children of Nazis, maybe because of some hidden frisson, there is remarkably little interest in the children of refugees from Nazism. They have rarely been systematically included in major histories. The experience of political refugees, which I'll be coming on to, and their children in the UK is almost completely ignored. Breaking the Silence considers the effects on children whose parents were refugees from Nazism, the second generation. Around 50,000 refugees finally settled in the UK. Refugees from Nazism arrived in Britain before the war. Very few, maybe about 5,000, came here from the camps after the end of the war. So unlike America or Israel, the second generation in the United Kingdom are not the children of camp survivors, who have in fact been far more regularly studied. This book is not about the refugee or the children's understanding of their refugee parents. Its concern is with the second generation participant. I call the people I interviewed participants. And how they had been affected by their family history. I was particularly interested in whether if the parent had fled because they had actively opposed the Nazis, that would have a distinct impact on the child's reaction, a topic which I think is very suitable for this gathering of socialists. What precipitated the book was the response to my semi-autobiographical novel. Because what happened was second generation people kept on saying to me, nobody before has told me their story. This tells my story. One person said to me, I've waited all my life to talk to somebody like you. So I decided that these stories had to be recorded. It was awful writing this book. It hurt. The subject matter is dreadful. And even talking about it is actually quite emotional. The book's heart are my interviews with 12 members of the second generation, so this is not a quantitative study. The interviews allow us to hear the voices of the second generation and gives us some understanding of how heavy a hand the past can have. The participants' parents came from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, countries invaded by the Nazis, and from Germany and Austria. Thank goodness for the election result. Not for lack of trying, all the participants came from professional backgrounds, but that makes the contrast between their public success and their private discontents the more striking. The primary focus of almost all the literature on the second generation is trauma and transferred trauma. Though I do have my criticisms of this approach, it is worth beginning by mentioning a few of the more apposite writers. Dinah Wardy, writing from a therapeutic perspective about camp survivors and their children, looks at how the second generation live in the shadow of their damaged parents. Wardy posits that the child is regularly not seen as a separate individual. The parent has lost much of their sense of identity and strives to find it through the child. The parents tended to be overpossessive of their children, with acute anxieties, some of us identify with that, with acute anxieties especially over separation, at the same time as having problems over bonding with their children. The parents convey to their children, especially the girls, that they are memorial candles, carrying a responsibility for the dead. The second generation child becomes overwhelmed by what had befallen relatives they had never known. Many kept imagining their grandparents' deaths. The child feels that the parent has suffered so much. How can they do anything which could cause further pain? Thus the child doesn't challenge the parent but also feels hostility and guilt towards them. Gabriele Rosenthal discusses how the past hangs over the second generation and how they carry on from the parents the burden of mourning. Aaron Hass, the child of Holocaust survivors and an American psychiatrist, emphasizes the silence, and again it's of the survivor parents towards their children. Indeed, in some of the families Rosenthal talked to, there was an effective prohibition about asking about a family member's past. The greater the past is blanked out, the greater can be the child's concern. Hass, on the other hand, stresses the difficulty the second generation often had in breaking the silence, and how often they didn't want to talk about the effect of the Holocaust on their families. Although my research was into the children of people who had got out before the outbreak of war, rather than the children of survivors, I did find some significant parallels. The participants in my study all talked about how their parents didn't talk to them about their grandparents, and so on. The murder of grandparents preoccupied almost every participant. Now I'm talking about my study. Many said something like, "I don't know about my grandparents." As Peter typically stated, he could not tell me one story about them. But at the same time, to quote him, he said, "When one's grandparents have been murdered, their absence can become overwhelming. I couldn't say why my strength of identification with that fact, that my grandparents were murdered, was so strong, but it was. Parent secrecy soured relationships between the participant and their parents, especially the mothers. Although I'm not developing on this today, the silence of the parents towards their children regularly created a suspicion or even hostility, so that respondents didn't trust their parents, didn't know if the parents were telling the truth. What the parents' silence also encouraged was a contradictory set of feelings by the participants about finding out about the secrets themselves. Everybody I interviewed only started searching for their history in their 50s or later. There was a deep ambivalence about finding out. I asked Tom why it was only recently he had researched his family. He said, "I didn't want to know more. I now know their last place was Lot's. It makes it too graphic. I felt like I'd cut myself. Somebody's talked about mutilation, much stronger than I wanted it to be. I didn't want to know they went to XYZ concentration camp. I could understand exactly why my mother didn't want to find out. It just makes it more real." Peter also talked about the emotional effect on him. "I don't know how far that finding out about his grandparents can go, because there's a level of vulnerability on my part that I don't know if I can get beyond." There was another reason for the silence. Mike explained why he didn't ask his father more questions. Protecting him from the pain of reliving his past, of his losses? Absolutely. To take my own case, I knew nothing of my past. To ask my parents about it caused the sort of pain few children want to inflict on their parents. I grew up without a history. Yet this absence of knowledge, this lack of a hinterland of stories, the place that the family came from, left the participants as a whole without a past. There was not even an extended family to tell family stories. There was no one left to remember. Finding out about their grandparents and wider kin had become an overwhelming concern for almost all the participants. Robert, in his late 60s, explained he'd only recently found out when he went to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. He explained, "I didn't know any of the details. I don't want to think about lots," and he wept. Isaac, one of the many people I chatted to but didn't formally interview, had gone to the Berlin Jewish Museum to look for the details of his murdered family, including his young cousins. Mike said, and this is a long quote, "I was trying to find out when they went to Terezin and when they left. I spent years trying to find out. It coloured my whole life. Whenever people talk of uncles, aunts, grandparents, I can't help thinking, what does that mean to me? I'm very angry about it. It's right inside my head all the time. But I can't talk about it really, not with the majority of people anyway." He continued, "Some things are very deep, deep in one's soul. I suppose the biggest thing is they died without ceremony, without knowing what they were going to face. It's very shocking. I think I always felt I had a mission to explain, to make sense of the family catastrophe. It gives one's life meaning to make sense of that. I feel that. Because my dad couldn't, was silent, I've got to speak." One respondent, Henry, had a different emphasis. He said the effect of the Holocaust was not so much living with the ghosts of the past, but how anxious it had left him in the now. Indeed, the issue of anxiety in different forms came up repeatedly during the different interviews. Although this is not my focus today, this loss of a past has led to various much debated academic theories about reconstituted memory and memorialization. What is certainly the case is that objects that had belonged to the dead but somehow survived, such as letters, became for some of the participants acutely important as significant objects and symbols. In almost every interview, the person showed deep emotion, including weeping, when referring to the few objects in their possession from their grandparents. The most acute was over photos. Tom, for example, described how he could hardly bear to look at family photos. He didn't know the people or their names. Children then developed an ability to read their parents. Robert said, "One thing I became aware of when I was quite young was my mother being in dreadful grief, and a number of times saying, 'I wished I had died with my little mother,' being in dreadful grief, screaming in pain. Tanya said, 'My mother was always sad, and my father sighed.' You absorb that. When I was a little girl and I'd wake up to a new day and life was so exciting, then I would go to the kitchen and my mother would be sitting there and greet me with, 'Today, so-and-so would have been so-and-so old.' The loss of family is intertwined with the absence of a sense of place. Any refugee will suffer from a sense of dislocation, the foreigner on an unknown shore. This dislocation takes various forms. Unlike many refugees, the experience of being a refugee from Nazism usually meant there was nothing and nobody to go back to. The country may still exist, even though with different frontiers, but your family, even the whole community, is gone. As Peter said, I feel close to wanting to cry every time I think about Siklosh, which is where my father is from. There is nothing there. Even when the place in your parents' home is still standing, it is of course lived in by a family who are unlikely to welcome your appearance. Moreover, there was an absence of identification with the country of one's parents. Although this applied to all the participants, it was the most acute when parents had been German. As one person said, how could she identify with Germany when it had killed her family? None of the participants seriously considered returning to live in their parents' country of origin. Mike, while stating he had considered but decided against returning to Czechoslovakia, said wistfully how people in Prague looked like him. None of the participants felt a desire to learn the language of their parents, nor had their parents encouraged them to do so. With one exception, Sarah, none of the parents spoke to their children in their first language. Neither did the participants see themselves as English, British. They did not feel this was their home. Sarah stated, "You never fit in. I always felt like an outsider. I was born here, but I never feel English. I'm a ruthless cosmopolitan." Robert called himself a Central European. Tom stated that he was a relic of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he later modified this by emphasizing how nonsensical it is to deny the influence on him of English culture. Almost everybody called themselves outsiders. So dislocation continues to affect the second generation. But the parents had wished their children to be assimilated. The participants had been born between the late 1930s and the mid-1950s, a period when both the British state and the Jewish establishment discouraged the refugee from being visible, Indeed, the children of refugees did not look different from other British children. They all spoke fluent English, better than their parents. Only one of the respondents appears to have been brought up within clearly Jewish traditions. A public display of Jewishness was downplayed or discouraged for the others. But this assimilation had its limitations. The respondents, as children, were regularly taunted at school for speaking funny. I was too. In a couple of cases, they were called Nazis. Their parents were thought peculiar. Tom said of the time his father arrived at a school event, "I remember being quite embarrassed by my father at having on quite an expensive fur coat and speaking with a definite Austrian accent." Peter, whose family lived outside London, was the only non-English person in his class. Friendships don't seem to have come easily for many of the participants. The parents were not always able to act out their desire for their child's assimilation. The children were regularly cut off, overprotected by needy, often insecure parents. So although born in Britain, the respondents suffered from dislocation, what has sometimes been called the immigration effect. It gives rise to a sense of being an exile from oneself, even identity terror. The concern with how exile had affected the second generation was made yet more complex by the respondents' own ambiguous relationship to Judaism. It was noticeable that there was no agreement amongst the respondents as to what being Jewish or coming from a Jewish background meant to them. Some of the respondents found it difficult to decide whether they were Jewish or not. Only one person, Henry, clearly embraced Judaism and its many rituals. Mike's secular Jewish father's Czech family had been virtually obliterated. Although his mother was not Jewish, Mike said the Holocaust had seared his Jewishness into his soul. Mike's family were assimilated, and his father, a socialist and an atheist, was not practicing. But Mike, although not practicing, was very conscious of having a Jewish heritage. He said, "I think I'm most proud of my Jewish background from my father. It means more to me than whether I'm English or not." Peter's entire Hungarian family, bar one aunt, had been obliterated, but Peter's Jewish family had not wanted to bring Peter up as a Jew. Peter said he was Jewish, though in his case, he said, this was nothing to do with religious or cultural beliefs, but was a moral issue. Peter's position was essentially that as long as there's anti-Semitism, he would be Jewish. Robert had been told as a child to deny being Jewish, although he knew he was. He called himself a hidden Jew. He said of himself, "I would first call myself a socialist. I infer I'm a man from my behaviour. And then I think very close behind I'm a Jew. I probably think I'm a Jew before I'm a man. I was a Jew until I was 8 years old." He had never been to a Jewish ceremony. Sarah, despite her Czech mother being Jewish and her father half Jewish, and despite the decimation of both families, did not identify herself as Jewish and insisted, "I don't give a stuff. I resent all this Holocaust stuff." The parents also did not circumcise any of the male participants who I dared ask. One participant said, I did ask most of them, one participant said, "The funny thing is that I wanted more and more when I was an adolescent, the notion that I had been circumcised. It was very important early on to see myself that way. I feel myself circumcised." Peter said, "I wasn't circumcised. It's classic about the ambivalence of it. He, his father, insisted when we were bathed on pushing back our prepuce so as to make it look not quite as if we were circumcised." The silence of the parents, the lack of a family network, the absence of identification with a sense of place or other cultural identifiers encouraged a sense in most of the participants of not feeling their life was quite their own, linked to the often subterranean process of mourning. I want to now turn to whether parents who had fled for political reasons affected their second-generation children in different ways. Thank you, Richard. Little has been written about political refugees, very little. Though these were the very men and women one might expect to be celebrated. Very few people, around 1,000, got out of Germany for political reasons in the first years after the Nazis took power and got into the UK. Though precise figures were never collected, at the very most 5,000 political refugees were admitted here by 1940. The KPD, not everyone may agree with this, but the KPD contributed to the arrest and murder of many of their cadres by their failure to recognize in 1933 that Nazism was not just a passing phase. Communists in other countries taken over by the Nazis had the relative advantage of knowing what would happen. Depending on the exact year, political refugees were more likely to head to France, Czechoslovakia, good either, to fight in the Spanish Civil War, or even fatally, usually, to head to the USSR. Ironically, it was the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, a government-sponsored organisation, which got out many Czech communists shortly before the outbreak of war. The more general picture, though, was that the government did not want communists here, especially in Jewish and German. My main focus here is with the children of communists, not with social democrats. I never managed to interview anybody who had social democratic parents, partly because so few became refugees and were allowed in, partly because many then went back to their country of origin. In addition, my concern was with the impact on children of having parents who had been actively anti-Nazi. The distinction between political and non-political refugees proved complex. What I found was that in one sense or another, most though not all of the respondents had parents who had been knowingly anti-Nazi. The reason for flight, whether it was for political reasons because of anti-Semitism, was not always clear or known to their children. For example, Tom's mother had been active in the illegal Austrian Young Socialists. She was about 16, and was imprisoned, but then was allowed to get out as a Jew. I suspect the reason for exile may often have been blurred. The high number of parents with soft political views may partly be because I used what is called snowballing to gather the sample, which meant I was drawing on people known in my left-wing network. Guess what? Though with one exception not known to me. I also suspect that people who were politically aware were more likely to spot the way the political wind was blowing and get out in time. I strongly suspect that. Nevertheless, I suspect my sample to be reasonably representative. Drawing any definitive conclusions from so small a group of people isn't possible, but some patterns do emerge. What surprised me, though it shouldn't have given my own background, were their apparent similarities in all the parents' behaviour towards the participants. None of the parents spoke in any detail about the past. The parents who'd taken on the Nazis also didn't speak. Tanya, like almost all the respondents, felt her parents held terrible secrets. She talks about finding her communist mother regularly weeping when small, without knowing why. As she later realised, her communist mother feared for her non-Jewish family left behind and inaccessible in Germany. John's Austrian communist father had told him a bit about the relatives who hadn't made it. He drew diagrams, who died where and when, but he didn't talk about it, and I didn't ask him. He never revealed any emotion, just diagrams. But there are specific reasons why political parents did not talk to their children. As Gradvold suggests, the need for secrecy in anti-Nazi organizations in the 1930s encouraged a culture of silence, which stretched well beyond the defeat of Nazism. In addition, the ideological hold of the Cold War meant that anti-Nazi histories were marginalized and did not become part of dominant academic discourse. Unlike the disappearance of institutional anti-Semitism, the British and American states in the post-war period, with only a very short pause, continued to persecute anybody they saw as having communist sympathies. Parents who had been close to communist organizations were also unlikely to want to draw attention to themselves. As Gradvold argues, even though some, like my parents, that's not Gradvold, even though some, like my parents, had ceased to support the communist movement, they would often not have wanted to give voice to anti-communist attitudes or criticize their previous beliefs. My father was not, I suspect, untypical in not wanting to brag about his anti-Nazi activities. Yeah. He owed it to his dead comrades not to present himself in any sort of heroic light. Yeah. I mean, there's also the issue of paranoia. I mean, I think our political parents had been persecuted in Germany or wherever, and therefore they carried that on as well. Thus, all the participants, including those whose parents had actively opposed the Nazis, talked of the suffocating silence of their parents. Hardly any standard academic studies touch on the trauma or experience of people who opposed and then fled the Nazis. Nor was there a focus on how imprisonment, or worse, as John and Tanya's communist parents experienced, contributed to their parents' trauma and disinclination to talk. I mean, it just doesn't exist. I've read the stuff. It isn't there. Anyway, a subject for another time, but a scale of victimhood has developed in the Holocaust industry. Tanya, whose father had been imprisoned and tortured, talked of how he bore the physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. One of the few studies that potentially has relevance to the political refugee is Yehuda's 1997 study, which compares the effect of being a camp survivor and going into hiding during the Nazi years, and concludes that having been in hiding is correlated with just as high a level of trauma as being a camp survivor. Hass's emphasis is different. Those who were active anti-Nazis, in that they joined the partisans and fought back against the Nazis, emerge, he suggests, with a greater sense of self-worth. By the way, I mean, I'm talking about odd paragraphs in these people's studies. This distinction is fundamental, although one has to take care about deducing the transference of a psychological state from a parent's politics. Did the parents who had organized against the Nazis pass on to their children a greater sense of self-worth? It is therefore of interest that the children of the two active anti-Nazi communist parents, John and Tanya, both explicitly rejected seeing themselves as victims. While the second generation network are right to understand their lives as having been profoundly affected by the past, this is not the same as seeing oneself primarily as a victim because a Jew, as too often occurs in second generation circles. This approach often gets wrapped up in support for Israel. John, explaining why he didn't attend second generation meetings, said, "What didn't ring a bell with me was this idea of being a victim," and he laughed. "I never saw myself as a victim. Much to my surprise, a woman once told me at a second generation meeting, that was when I still went to them, how lucky I was. Her parents had had to flee because they were being hunted as Jews. They had not resisted, she said, unlike mine." Ruth Kitchen argues in a paper on Charlotte Delbo that resistance, wonderful, anyone here who hasn't read Charlotte Delbo, please do, that resistance allowed the anti-Nazi to maintain a less fractured self and a greater ability to reassemble the pieces, which will impact on their children. Maybe when the parents of the second generation provided a coherent, even if not personalized, narrative of the past, this encouraged the child's understanding of why their parents had become refugees and therefore lessened the chance of their seeing themselves as victims. One other difference which only struck me from personal experience is that political refugees who did not come from a Jewish background were far more likely to have surviving family. I remember my shock when I suddenly realised that for all my parents' accurate insistence that they had fled as anti-Nazis in 1933, the reason I had virtually no family was that the Nazis had murdered them as Jews. Indeed, Tanya, who came from a non-Jewish background and whose family were not consequently murdered, gave the only interview where the issue of grandparents did not push itself to the fore. It is the murder of grandparents which weighs down on many in the second generation. The absence of a family means an absence of a sense of rootedness, which applies whether parents fled as anti-Nazis or not. One last difference, I've still got time, one last difference relates to the issue of dislocation. John and Tanya's communist parents returned to Germany and Austria after the end of the war. This was typical. Many of the communists returned to what was to become East Germany or Austria, even to Czechoslovakia. Similarly, committed Social Democrats went back, though not in the same numbers. Unlike the non-political parents, who generally wanted nothing more to do with their countries of origin, but wanted to settle into their new country, the political parents' motive was to rebuild a new socialist world. My parents were exceptional, they would be. Having totally fallen out with the KPD in the late 1930s, though still on the left, nothing would have dragged them back to either Germany. But born in the UK, neither John nor Tanya wanted to stay in their parents' new countries, and both moved back to the UK. How far can the children of refugees who return to their parents' country of birth ever feel at home there? John, who returned here in his early 20s, said, "When people ask me where are your roots, I have no answer. I certainly don't feel German, although I went to school there. I don't feel Austrian, which is what his father was, and I couldn't possibly say I'm English." I want to end this section by stating that here we have a range of differences and similarities, not a dichotomy. The differences between the children of political and non-political parents should not be overemphasized. And my last bit is about today, because you'll see why. I want to end by briefly looking at some comparison with today's refugees. First, I want to touch on government policy towards refugees in the 1930s and now. Although the British state welcomed neither the refugees from Nazism nor today's refugees, the national government under Baldwin, not a government known for its liberal policies, admitted 10,000 children from the kinder transport in a matter of months. And something between 40 to 70,000 refugees altogether, many of whom arrived in the 12 months before the outbreak of war. The Home Secretary Hall actually agreed to provide group, not individual, visas for the kinder transports, which one can only wish that this government had done for the children in the jungle. Of course, the numbers saved were not nearly enough. The popular construction of the kinder transport is now used to divert attention from how few the national government accepted. 1 in 10. That's 9 in 10 who were not accepted. Yeah. The kinder transport also provides this government with ideological cover. While it only admits 500 children from the jungle, it exhorts us about how the kinder transport reveals how generous Britain has been towards refugees. Yet less than 4,000 Syrian adult refugees have so far been accepted out of the meagre 20,000 promised over 5 years. Almost indistinguishable from UKIP, the government justifies its failure to open its doors by arguing that, unlike in the 1930s, the refugees can go somewhere else. There are some similarities. For example, the hostility by some towards refugees then and now. The Jews were going to take your jobs, as will today the refugees of European migrants. That's not me saying that. And though refugees from Nazism were not accused of being potential terrorists, the fact that tens of thousands of refugees fleeing Nazism were interned in the Isle of Man and elsewhere in 1940 reveals how far they were seen as a potential fifth column. And I mean, by the way, if you were suspected of being a communist, you were likely to be sent to Canada or Australia. The Isle of Man was quite close by comparison. Today, refugees are presented as potentially posing a threat to national security, more so in France or the US, but also here. The term of Jew and Muslim, I mean, you know, we need to deconstruct them, but not now, are also both ideological constructions, creating a racist stereotype and turning the refugee into the other. But I want to suggest a couple of differences. The dominant discourse since the 1970s has been multiculturalism, with all its limitations, partly thanks to the organised opposition to racism from the 1970s onwards in the UK. It is generally safe for refugees and migrants, often indistinguishable, despite what the government tells us, to appear dressed in ways with which they are culturally comfortable. Refugees often speak to their children in their original language. Their second-generation child becomes bilingual. Schools recognise Eid. On the other hand, the refugees from Nazism were encouraged to assimilate, but that's what they also generally wanted to do. Another difference is that the earlier refugees generally wanted to settle here. There was generally nothing for them to go back to. The refugees today talk about wanting to go back home. Although I don't want to underestimate the barbarism of the war in Syria, no state-organised ethnic cleansing of the same magnitude is taking place as under the Nazis. At least some members of the refugees' families will probably survive. With luck, there will be a home to go back to. So the sense of dislocation by the children of the refugees may be experienced differently. It is as yet unclear how far the children of refugees from Nazism sense the feeling both outsiders in the country where they were born and little connection to the country where their parents were born is particular to them. The more family members survive, the greater the possibility of the reconstitution of the family, something evidently unlikely when the family were almost all murdered. My father, I was to discover, made real efforts to find who in his family and amongst his comrades had survived the war. He didn't find any comrades. No, he did. He found one. He found Harry. He found a few relatives, but the closest was in Italy, the furthest in Brazil. He had never known any of them before he had fled, and his attempts to rebuild a network or reconstitute his family through letters largely petered out. Modern technology, email, Skype, Twitter, may diminish the effect of geographical dislocation and make maintaining contact slightly easier for the modern refugee. It took me a long time to try to fill the gaps, break down the silences, to find those whose names were never spoken. One hopes that the modern refugee family do not maintain the silence and emotional barriers towards their children that characterize so many families of Nazi refugees. We are witnessing a shift in the dominant discourse towards refugees. Racist influence is increasing. As in the 1930s, the hysteria of the Daily Mail and other media outlets and the increasing UKIP-like talk of the government towards refugees is legitimating a hostility towards refugees. Though one has to suspect public opinion polls, it seems only just over half of people polled supported allowing in children from the jungle. In a period of increasing economic insecurity and inequality, we need to oppose whenever and however possible all forms of racism. Thank you.